written by ex-Sergeant N. Goldthorpe, number 251, 18th West Yorkshire Regiment. I enlisted the 14th of February 1915 in the Bradford PALS 18th Battalion, West Yorkshire Regiment, and was given the number 251. The minimum age for enlistment at that time was 19, but although I was only 18 years and 9 months, all one had to say was that he was 19 and nobody cared two hoots. You were in, providing you passed the doctor. There were 3 battalions of Bradford PALS. The 16th formed in September 1914, the 18th February 1915, and the 20th a few months later. The first 3 months of my army life was spent at the old skating rink, Manningham Lane, now the Mecca Dance Hall. We fed and slept at home, parading each morning at 9 a.m. to 12 noon and 2 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. We were paid 21 shillings per week to cover food and lodgings. Our training consisted chiefly of physical drill and short route marches, all very pleasant and jolly. After a few weeks we were kitted out and the gradual transformation from civilians to soldiers was taking place. Early May we were transferred to Mitchell Park, West Bowling, under canvas. We were only there 1 week before marching out and heading for Ripon in 2 stages, the first night being spent at Spacey houses. Just before entering Ripon, we were joined by our 1st Battalion, the 16th, who had marched from their camp at Skipton. We were about the first troops to be stationed at Ripon, but before the war ended, Ripon became a tremendous encampment for many thousands. In passing, I might state the pay of a private was 7 shillings per week. Out of this, if you so wished, you allowed your next of kin 3 and 6, which in my case was made up to 10 and 2pence for my mother to draw each week. My wage was therefore the princely sum of 3 and 6. Our stay at Ripon was very pleasant, with weekend leave home about every 3 weeks. Late August, and we were on the move again, this time to a camp on the Wiltshire Downs called Fovant, about 10 miles west of Salisbury. By this time I had been promoted to Lance Corporal, but what was more important to me than the promotion was the consequent rise in pay to 5 and 3 per week. Our stay at Fovant lasted until December 5th, when we entrained for Liverpool to embark on the Empress of Britain, which sailed on December 7th, where to nobody knew, but nothing like a troop ship for rumours, and according to these we were destined for every port in the world. It was a most uncomfortable voyage, the ship being badly overcrowded, but after 4 days we were safely through the Straits of Gibraltar and in the Mediterranean. 14th of December saw us arrive in the Grand Harbour at Malta, where only officers were allowed ashore. December 17th and we were off again, finally arriving at Port Said on December 21st. We disembarked the day after, and I don't think anyone was sorry to leave that stinking ship. Christmas 1915 was spent under canvas at Port Said, and as we received our first pay for over a month, a good time was had by all exploring the sights of this eastern city. We left Port Said by train on January 1st, 1916, for Kantara, some 20 to 25 miles down the Suez Canal, and we pitched tents on the east side, on the edge of the Sinai Desert. The day after our arrival, at a drumette service conducted by the Reverend Thornton, our chaplain, who in peacetime was a curate at Bradford Parish Church, now the cathedral, told us that we were standing on the camel route from Palestine into Egypt, and that it was most probably the route that Christ took on his journey into Egypt. The canal was crossed by a pontoon bridge, manually worked, for which the battalion regularly provided working parties. It was most interesting to watch the large liners sailing past on their way to Australia and the Far East. Why were we there? History tells us that the Turks made an attack on the canal at Kantara in the spring of 1915 and were repulsed by the Australians, so presumably we were there in the event of another attack. Life was very pleasant and the war seemed a long way away. Plenty of bathing in the canal and only early morning parades, because in spite of the fact that it was only January, it was too hot during the day for much exertion. This pleasant state of affairs continued until the 24th of February, when we moved from Kantara to a camp 7 miles into the desert, and that was the nearest we got to the Turks. We were only destined to stay there 4 days, and on Monday the 28th it was back to Kantara, but only for another 4 days, when, on March 2nd, we entrained again to return to Port Said. We could almost sense something unpleasant was in store for us, and in the near future, but whatever it was only what we had joined up and trained for. I remember distinctly dear old John Bland, A Company Commander, who was later sent home to become Lord Mayor of Bradford, saying that he would throw his hat in the air if only we were staying in Egypt. He wasn't the only one. On the 10th of March we embarked on the SS Britain and sailed at 5 p.m. The Cook's tour for the Bradford PALS is over. After an uneventful voyage we arrived at Marseille on the 15th and the following day entrained for our journey north. We were exactly 2 days and 4 hours in that stop-go train to eventually arrive at a place called Pont Remy. We immediately took to the road and after a 7-mile march arrived at Citernes, where we were billeted out in barns and any place which provided cover. We stayed here exactly 1 week, during which I was promoted to corporal. It was here we could hear the first sound of the guns. On the 25th of March we began our move up to the line in easy stages. First day, Longpre, 9 mile. Second day, Vinacourt, 12 mile. Third day, Beauval, 12 miles. Fourth day, rest. Fifth day, Boucain. Sixth day, Bouzart. This brought us within a few miles of the line, and it was from here, Saturday, 1st of April, I was a member of a small party to be taken on a sightseeing tour of the trenches. We were only in a couple of hours. 2 days later, Monday, we moved a little nearer to a place we were to get to know very well, Bus-Liatoy, and a visit to the Estamina has been a must for every pilgrimage where the usual meal of egg and chips, when one could afford such a luxury, is still served. A wreath is laid on the cenotaph and a short service of remembrance, attended by all the villagers, also takes place. It was Easter Monday, 24th of April, when the battalion occupied the trenches for the first time. It was only a short tour of duty, 4 days to be precise, and on being relieved we were taken to billets at Bertrancourt. We didn't take over in the line again until 19th of May, and this time for 5 days. We were being steadily prepared for the slaughter. For the next 2 or 3 weeks it was in and out of the line for short spells. On June 20th we were marched to a pleasant little village, Giesencourt, about 14 miles away, where for the next few days we practiced the forthcoming attack over trenches which had been dug to represent those of the enemy. We had to proceed in single file, 20 paces between each file, at a slow walk, in other words, sitting ducks for the Germans. My little squad consisted of 8 men and myself. We were now fully conditioned for the forthcoming slaughter, and with words of encouragement from the brass hats, who weren't going with us, we were consigned to the furnace. It was now back to bus, to be finally fitted out with all the accoutrements of an infantry soldier. I personally had on a waistcoat with pockets for 8 or 10 mils bombs, in addition to rifle and bayonet. June 30th, we left our camp at Bus at 11 p.m, headed by the Bant for a short distance, and entered the trenches at the Sucre colling camps. Our assembly trenches had been newly dug and were well behind the front line. The object of the battle was as follows: July 1st, 7:30 a.m, 0 hour for the 15th, Leeds PALS, who were to take the enemy's first line in front of Sayre. 8 a.m, 0 for the 16th, 1st Bradford PALS, who would leapfrog the 15th and take his second line. 8:30 a.m, 0 for the 18th, 2nd Bradford PALS. We had to take his third line, and myself with my little squad of bombers would then proceed another 150 yards down a communication trench and build a barricade to forestall a counterattack. It was going to be a piece of cake, according to the high-ups, one of whom addressed us just before we left Bus. He told us that owing to the terrific number of shells which had fallen on the enemy trenches, opposition would be light, and that although he realised we would have a small number of casualties, he would be waiting to congratulate us when we returned. So jolly good luck to you, and I only wish I was going with you. What a fool! Or was it we who believed him? Anyway, he could have taken my place with pleasure. As 8:30 approached, we became very tense and quiet. We had no means of knowing what was happening in front of us. My own thoughts were of home, and hoping I would be given courage and wouldn't let my pals down. I remember saying a little prayer, and just before we climbed out, our officer, Lieutenant Poisey, said he knew that he wouldn't come back. I told him to believe he would, as I certainly believed I would. Just 58 years to the day, I stood beside his grave in Euston Road Cemetery and paid my last respects to a very fine gentleman. Well, whistles sounded 0 and out we scrambled. Right from the start the attack met with a hurricane of fire, and our ranks were soon sadly depleted. We couldn't have gone above 30 or 40 yards when we threw ourselves flat, and it was at this point I saw our colonel, Kinnard, trying to rally us to go forward. He was walking around as if he was out for a peacetime stroll. What a brave man! He was never seen again, and his name appears on the Thiepval Memorial, missing, with no known grave. It was at this point that our officer, Poisey, said he would crawl forward and see what was happening, leaving me and my little squad, now reduced to 4, behind a small hillock. Mr. Poisey hadn't gone any more than a couple of yards when he was killed, and there was nothing we could do for him. What had we to do now, as there wasn't a living soul in sight? It was obvious we couldn't go forward, and we had been told that any man who returned to our own trenches unless he was wounded would be shot. After some considerable time, and things had quietened down somewhat, Private Smith, he, after the war, worked for Weights and Measures, Bradford, very gallantly volunteered to go back to our line for instructions. Although he was continually fired upon, he safely made it, and returned within hailing distance that we had to go back. Being the senior, I ordered the remaining 2 to go back in short bursts at 3-minute intervals. I followed 3 minutes after the last man, and I am glad to report that in spite of heavy fire we all made it. We joined about 20 other men, along with the only surviving officer in A Company. We remained manning the trenches until the night of the 4th and 5th, and I well remember the torrential rain on the 4th and how we had to almost swim the last few yards of the communication trench before reaching dry land. We had about a dozen yards to go when a voice from out of the darkness up above, we learned afterwards that the voice was that of the divisional general, said, "Come on, boys, only another dozen yards." When a little fellow who hailed from Halifax answered, "It's all right for thee up there, you big so-and-so, but I'm drowning down here." Titus from the general staff. But it was little incidents like this which helped us to retain a sense of humour in the most dire conditions. We heard no more about it. We were instructed to make our way to a village about 9 miles away where we would be fed and rested. It was daylight when we arrived, and after a hot meal we were told we could sleep as long as we wanted. There would be no reveille. What a hope! We had been down no more than 4 hours when we were awakened with the news that the Corps Commander was on his way to inspect us. He would have kept well away if he could have heard some of the remarks. It was only when we were mustered on parade and saw what a pathetic few of us were left that we realised what grief there would be in many Bradford homes when the news reached them. Well, the great man duly arrived mounted, and with a lancer on each side, spoke a few words of utter rubbish, about turned and galloped off, the whole proceedings taking no more than a couple of minutes. We were soon moved north to a place called Leicestrom, where I was promoted to sergeant, where we soon began to receive reinforcements, but towards the end of July it was back into the trenches in front of Bethune. It was supposed to be a quiet sector, but the very first night proved anything but quiet. After a terrific German bombardment, a large party of enemy troops raided our B Company. I was with A Company on the immediate right. He got away with over 20 of our chaps, including the renowned Dickie Bond, the famous Bradford City footballer. The enemy didn't get off scot-free and left behind quite a number of dead. For the next 2 or 3 months it was in and out of the line for a few days at a time, chiefly around the Bethune area, and it was during one of our tours in early November that I received a knock on the head which put me into hospital at Le Touquet. Not sufficiently serious to get me to Blighty, but bad enough to keep me in hospital until Boxing Day. When I rejoined the battalion, they had just come out of the line for an extended rest, and it was during this time, February 1917, that I had my first leave home. We now held the line in front of Gomico Woods, and with the Germans retiring to the Hindenburg line, we found ourselves moving forward against little opposition. On the 4th of May, my 21st birthday, our Colonel, Carter, sent for me and informed me that he had recommended me for a commission, and on July 10th I said goodbye to the Bradford PALS, because on passing out at the Officers' Training School at Rill, I was posted to the East Yorkshire Regiment. Even after almost 60 years, it is impossible not to be stricken silent or moved to the point of tears by the knowledge of what happened on the morning of July 1st, 1916. As a matter of interest, our casualties were as follows. Approximate strength of each battalion, 1,000. Leeds PALS 15th West Yorkshire Regiment, 47 survived. Bradford PALS 16th West Yorkshires, 106 survived. And our battalion, the 18th, 117 survived. Every officer in all 3 battalions was killed except one.